The plain below Ilipa in southern Spain is wide, flat, and utterly without cover. And in the spring of 206 BCE, the man looking down on it from the Carthaginian camp had every reason to feel safe. Hasdrubal Gisco commanded, by Polybius's count, 70,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants. The Roman army facing him numbered perhaps 45,000, and nearly half of those were Spanish allies, whose loyalty had already changed sides once in this war. For several days running, the two armies performed the same ritual. Late in the afternoon, the Romans marched out of their camp and formed a line, legions in the center, Spaniards on the wings. Hasdrubal answered, matched the formation, and the two armies stood watching each other across the plain until dusk, when both withdrew without a fight. Every day the same hour, every day the same arrangement. Hasdrubal read the routine as caution, and he settled into it. Then, one morning, before the Carthaginian troops had eaten, before most of them were even armed, the entire Roman army was already on the plain in battle order, and nothing about it was where it had been the day before. By nightfall, the Carthaginian army in Spain had effectively ceased to exist. So how does a general with fewer men, weaker allies, and no element of surprise in the ordinary sense, destroy a larger professional army on open ground in a single day? The answer is a deception technique that Roman commanders used for close to 500 years, from the war against Hannibal to the wars against Parthia, a technique so consistent that a Roman consul eventually wrote it into a field manual that still survives, word for word, and that most modern textbooks quote constantly without ever naming. I will give you the name of that manual and the man who wrote it near the end of this video, because once you know where it came from, you will start seeing this trick in almost every Roman victory you have ever heard of. Here is exactly what this video will cover. First, the full mechanics of Ilipa, including the breakfast order Scipio gave at 3 in the morning that decided the battle before a single javelin was thrown. Second, the night march of 207 BCE that removed a Roman consul and 7,000 picked men from Hannibal's front for nearly 2 weeks, without Hannibal ever noticing they were gone, a disappearance that, according to Livy, ended Carthage's last real hope of winning the war. Third, the false battle plan that the general Ventidius Bassus deliberately fed to a dinner guest he knew was a spy, and how that single lie pulled an entire Parthian army onto the one hillside in Syria where it could be annihilated. Fourth, the 5 working rules of the Roman deception system itself, the pattern that connects all of these battles, laid out one by one. And fifth, the surviving Roman manual that codified all of it, written by a 3-time consul, and the strange reason it almost never appears on a modern reading list. One note on sources before we begin. Everything in this video traces back to 4 ancient authors: Polybius, who interviewed veterans of the Spanish campaigns and had personally walked some of this ground; Livy, writing with access to earlier annalists now lost to us; Appian, and a 4th writer whose identity is the payoff at the end. Where their numbers disagree, I will tell you, because the disagreements are themselves part of the story. Start with Ilipa properly, because the surviving accounts, above all the 11th book of Polybius, let us reconstruct it almost hour by hour. The Roman commander was Publius Cornelius Scipio, 29 years old, the future Africanus, and in 206 BCE, he was not yet a legend. He had announced himself 3 years earlier by taking New Carthage, the enemy's Spanish capital, in a single day, and he had beaten one Carthaginian army at Baecula in 208. But the war in Spain was not close to won, and he was a general with a dangerous problem. His legions, perhaps 25,000 Italian troops, were outnumbered by Hasdrubal's African and Iberian infantry, and the rest of his army was made up of Spanish tribal allies, contingents raised by chieftains whose commitment was to the winning side, not to Rome. Livy, for what it is worth, admits that some of his sources cut the Carthaginian total down to 50,000, but even the low figure leaves Scipio outnumbered in the troops that mattered. And the family history here is not abstract. In 211, Celtiberian allies in Roman pay had been quietly bought off by Carthaginian money, and had simply marched away in the middle of a campaign, and Scipio's father Publius and his uncle Gaius, the two Roman commanders in Spain, had been overwhelmed and killed within about a month of each other. Scipio, in other words, was commanding an army whose largest single component had, within living memory, gotten his own father killed, against an enemy who outnumbered him, on ground that offered no ambush, no river, no hill to hide behind. What he had instead was time and an audience. Every army in the ancient world watched its enemy's camp. Scouts counted standards, noted where the smoke rose and when, watched which gate the cavalry used. Scipio understood that this surveillance was not a threat, it was a channel. And he could broadcast on it. So for day after day he transmitted the same message. The Romans deploy late in the afternoon. The Romans put their legions in the center, opposite Hasdrubal's best African infantry, exactly as convention demanded, because every general put his best troops in the center. The Romans do not want to fight. Hasdrubal's scouts carried that message home every evening, and every evening it was true, which is the detail most retellings miss. Scipio was not lying yet. He was teaching. Then, on the chosen night, the transmission changed. According to Polybius, Scipio sent his orders around the tents while it was still dark. The men were to eat a full meal before dawn, arm immediately after, and the cavalry and light troops were to ride straight at the Carthaginian outposts at first light. Think about what that breakfast order actually was. It was logistics as a weapon. A soldier who has eaten can stand in formation for hours. A soldier dragged from sleep to battle line cannot, and Scipio had arranged for 70,000 enemies to skip a meal. When Hasdrubal woke to the sound of Roman cavalry among his pickets, he did the only thing the previous week had trained him to do. He hurried his army out of camp to match the Roman line, and his men went out unfed, because the Romans had never before deployed early, and no meal had been prepared. And when the sun came up fully and the dust settled, Hasdrubal could see the second half of the trap. The Roman line was reversed. The legions were not in the center anymore. Scipio had placed his Spanish allies in the middle, opposite Hasdrubal's African veterans, and put his Roman legions on the wings, under his trusted subordinates Silanus and Marcius, opposite Hasdrubal's weakest Iberian levies. Notice that this single arrangement solved both of his problems at once. The allies he could not fully trust were given a job that required no valor at all: advance slowly and refuse contact, while the decisive fighting was reserved for the troops he knew would do it. Hasdrubal's army was already formed. In front of an advancing enemy, he could not safely rearrange 60,000 men. An ancient battle line that tries to reshuffle itself under attack dissolves into a mob. His best troops were now locked in the center, facing opponents who had orders to advance slowly and simply not fight, while at both ends of his line, Roman legions wheeled inward through complex converging maneuvers Polybius describes in loving detail, cohorts peeling into column, swinging wide, then turning in against the flanks with the velites and cavalry folded in behind them, a parade ground evolution performed at battle speed against a live enemy. The javelins of the light troops stampeded the elephants, which turned and plowed through their own cavalry. The African veterans, the finest infantry Carthage had in Spain, stood in the center all day, hungry, pinned, and essentially useless, watching their army die around them. By afternoon, hunger and heat finished what the maneuver had started, and the Carthaginian line sagged backward toward its camp until the retreat became flight. A rainstorm ended the pursuit, and days later the remnant was gone. Hasdrubal Gisco had fled to Gades, and Carthaginian Spain was finished. The second-order consequences alone would justify the battle's fame. The Numidian prince Massinissa, who had fought for Carthage that day, read the result and changed sides. And it was Massinissa's cavalry 4 years later at Zama that gave Scipio the mounted superiority that finally beat Hannibal himself. Now hold on to the shape of Ilipa, a routine publicly performed, repeated until it became the enemy's assumption, then broken all at once with total commitment. Because that shape is about to repeat across 3 centuries, and it is not a coincidence. It is a doctrine. And this is the part no textbook stops to explain. The mechanism rests on something so ordinary that historians mention it in a sentence and move on: the Roman marching camp. Every night on campaign, a Roman army built a fortified camp, and, as Polybius describes at length in his 6th book, every camp had the same layout. Surveyors rode ahead of the column and planted flags, and by the time the army arrived, every maniple already knew its plot. Same rectangular plan, same 2 main streets crossing at right angles, same gate positions, same location for the commander's tent, the praetorium, at the center, same cleared strip inside the rampart, whether the army was in Spain, Gaul, or Syria. Polybius says a Roman soldier entering camp was like a man coming home to his own city, and centuries later Josephus, watching the legions in Judea, marveled that a fortified town seemed to spring out of the ground in an afternoon. Modern books present this as an achievement of engineering and discipline, which it was. But look at it from the enemy scout side of the hill, and the camp becomes something else entirely. It becomes a blank wall. A scout watching a tribal army learns things every hour: who is quarreling, which contingent is packing to leave, where the chief sleeps, whether the fires are multiplying or thinning out. A scout watching a Roman camp learns nothing, because every Roman camp looks like every other Roman camp on every other day, down to the trumpet calls, which sounded the same watches at the same hours in every province of the empire. The uniformity that historians praise as discipline was also, functionally, information denial. Inside that wall, a Roman general could feed troops early or late, mass them at one gate or another, detach a column in darkness, and the outside of the camp betrayed none of it. That is the first half of the mechanism. The Romans made themselves unreadable. The second half is that they made the enemy readable, and then went further and made the enemy predictable. Roman armies screened themselves with dedicated scouts, the exploratores, who ranged ahead of the column, and deeper penetration agents, the speculatores, who operated inside enemy territory in disguise, and whose job descriptions survive in the ancient military writers. Prisoners and deserters were interrogated systematically, and their stories cross-checked against each other, which is why Roman commanders so often knew an enemy's supply state and internal politics better than the enemy's own allies did. A commander who controls what the enemy sees does not merely hide his intentions. He can rent out the enemy's eyes and use them to deliver a message of his own choosing. Repeat a behavior long enough, and the enemy's scouts stop reporting an observation and start reporting an assumption. The Romans deploy in the afternoon. The Romans keep their legions in the center. At that point, the deception is complete before the lie is even told, because the victim is now doing the general's work for him, filling in the pattern on his own. Cognitive scientists have a name for the machinery being exploited here: expectation-driven perception, the brain's habit of seeing what it has been trained to predict rather than what is actually in front of it. And the Romans were engineering it 2,000 years before anyone measured it in a laboratory. And notice what this means for Ilipa. Hasdrubal was not beaten at dawn. He was beaten during the boring week before, one uneventful afternoon at a time. And the historians who skip those afternoons to get to the battle are skipping the actual weapon. If Ilipa were the only case, you could call it one brilliant man's improvisation. So test the pattern against a different general, a different war, and a different century, starting 1 year earlier, at the most consequential Roman deception of the entire Second Punic War. In 207 BCE, Hannibal had been in Italy for 11 years, and his brother Hasdrubal Barca, a different Hasdrubal, had just crossed the Alps with a second army to reinforce him. If the brothers joined forces, Livy is frank about the stakes. Rome might not survive it. Facing Hannibal in the south was the consul Gaius Claudius Nero. Facing Hasdrubal in the north was the other consul, Marcus Livius Salinator. Then came the intercept. Hasdrubal sent 6 riders, 4 Gauls and 2 Numidians, carrying a letter to Hannibal naming the meeting point in Umbria, and those 6 men rode nearly the entire length of Italy undetected, only to be picked up by Roman foragers near Tarentum, almost within sight of their goal, and hauled before Nero. What Nero did next depended entirely on the camp trick. He picked 7,000 of his best men, 6,000 foot and 1,000 horse, and marched them out at night, while the camp opposite Hannibal kept every routine intact. Same tents standing, same fires lit, same trumpet calls at the same hours, same smoke at meal times. The remaining army spread to fill the same footprint. Hannibal, one of the most perceptive commanders who ever lived, a man who had baited Roman consuls into annihilation at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene precisely by reading their habits, watched that camp for roughly 2 weeks and, per Livy, saw nothing wrong. Meanwhile, Nero force-marched his column some 250 miles north in about a week, and Livy preserves the logistics that made it possible. Messengers rode ahead along the route asking the country people to bring food, drink, and fresh animals down to the roadside, so the soldiers marched carrying nothing but their weapons and ate as they walked, cheered through the towns like men already victorious. Nero slipped into Livius's camp at night with orders that not a single tent be added, and his men be doubled up into existing ones, so that Hasdrubal's scouts would count the same camp they had counted the day before. And here is the detail that proves how sharp both sides were at this game. It almost failed anyway. Riding out to observe the next morning, Hasdrubal noticed shields more weathered than they had been, horses leaner, as if from a hard march, and, decisively, he heard the trumpet signal sound twice in the consul's camp, once for each consul present, the acoustic signature of 2 consular armies where there should have been 1. He refused battle, tried to slip away north that night, and then the last of his luck ran out. His local guides deserted in the dark, and his army wandered along the bank of the river Metaurus, looking for a ford until daylight, and the pursuing Romans caught it. In the battle that followed, Nero, on the Roman right, found himself blocked by terrain, pulled his cohorts out of the line, marched them behind the entire Roman army, and threw them onto the Carthaginian right flank. One more pattern break, this time inside the battle itself. Hasdrubal Barca, seeing the day lost, spurred his horse into a Roman cohort and died fighting. And the way Hannibal finally learned of it completes the loop we opened at the start. Nero marched back south, as fast as he had come, and had his brother's severed head thrown in front of Hannibal's outposts. That was, according to the Roman tradition, the first notice Hannibal received that the campaign, and realistically the war, was lost. Livy has him say that he recognized in that face the fortune of Carthage, and he withdrew his army into the toe of Italy and never mounted another offensive. Second case, different direction, a century and a half later. In 52 BCE, Julius Caesar was on the wrong side of a flooded river in Gaul, the Alliae, swollen with spring melt, with Vercingetorix's army shadowing him along the far bank and every bridge cut. Caesar's solution, described in the 7th book of his own commentaries, was arithmetic disguised as theater. He hid 2 of his 6 legions in a wooded position near a broken bridge, then marched the remaining 4 away downstream with the entire baggage train, the column stretched and spaced to read, from across the water, as the full army of 6. Vercingetorix's scouts counted the columns, reported the whole Roman army moving south, and Vercingetorix followed along his bank. The hidden legions then rebuilt the bridge in hours, because Caesar had chosen that spot precisely since the lower pilings still stood intact in the riverbed, crossed, fortified the far side, and held it until Caesar doubled back with the rest. The Gauls had watched everything and seen nothing, because they were counting what they had been shown. Third case, and the strangest of the 3, because this time the channel was not the enemy's eyes, but a single pair of ears at a dinner table. In 38 BCE, the general Publius Ventidius Bassus was in Syria, facing a Parthian invasion led by the crown prince Pacorus, son of King Orodes. Ventidius's own biography reads like an argument that Rome promoted talent from anywhere. As a child, he had been carried as a captive in a Roman triumph after the Social War. He had made his living as an army mule contractor, and he had risen through Caesar's patronage all the way to the consulship. The year before, he had already smashed 2 Parthian forces at the Cilician Gates and the Amanus Pass. Now he had a subtler problem. He knew that a local dynast, called Cineas in one source, though another Roman writer records the name differently, one of those disagreements I promised you, was reporting everything to the Parthians, and instead of arresting him, he set the man's table. In his hearing, Ventidius worried aloud that his one fear was the Parthians crossing the Euphrates at the lower fords, far from his position, rather than at the usual crossing near his camp at Mount Gindarus. Cineas carried the fear to Pacorus, and Pacorus obligingly took the distant route, which cost the Parthian army more than a month of marching, time Ventidius used to concentrate his scattered legions. Then Ventidius let the Parthians cross the river completely unopposed, another calculated signal, because an unopposed crossing read as weakness, and even allowed them to approach his camp on the high ground without interference, which read as fear. It drew Pacorus straight uphill against a prepared Roman position, armored horsemen laboring up a slope into slingers whose lead bullets outranged Parthian bows, and then into legionaries charging downhill at the close quarters where cataphracts were helpless. The Parthian army was shattered at Gindarus, and Pacorus was killed defending his standard. Tradition placed the battle on the 9th of June, the anniversary 15 years on, of the day the Parthians had annihilated Crassus's legions at Carrhae. Ventidius sent Pacorus's head on a tour of the Syrian cities that had been wavering, and later that year he rode through Rome in the first triumph any Roman ever celebrated over Parthia, the former child captive, now the man in the chariot. 3 different generals, 3 different enemies, Carthaginian, Gallic, Parthian. 1 identical grammar. Control what the enemy perceives, let him build his assumption, then break it once, at full strength. So let us lay the system out plainly, as 5 working rules, because when you line the battles up side by side, the rules practically write themselves. Rule 1. Be unreadable by default. The standardized camp, identical every night in every province, meant a Roman army's external appearance carried no information, and everything the Metaurus campaign achieved began there, because Nero could only vanish from a camp whose outside never reflected its inside. Deception was not something Roman generals switched on for special occasions. The baseline condition of a Roman army was that it told observers nothing, which meant a lie when it came, had no background noise to clash against. And the near failure at the Metaurus shows the rule's other edge, because Hasdrubal Barca was undone by the 2 signals the Romans had not standardized away, the weathered shields and the doubled trumpet call, proof that in this doctrine, every observable detail is either controlled or it is a leak. Rule 2. Establish the pattern before you need it. Scipio spent days deploying late and conventionally before the one dawn that mattered, and the pattern phase looks like inactivity, which is exactly why chroniclers compress it and textbooks cut it. The waiting was the work. An enemy cannot be surprised by a broken routine unless someone first invests the time to build the routine, and Roman commanders treated those empty afternoons as ammunition expenditure. There is even a modern measurement of what that investment buys. The analyst Barton Whaley, in his study of stratagem across more than 160 modern battles, found that deception was the single cheapest multiplier of victory ever identified, because armies that achieved surprise won at casualty ratios their raw numbers could never explain, which is a 20th century statistical confirmation of what Scipio was doing with his boring afternoons. Rule 3. Use the enemy's own intelligence system as your delivery service. Scipio broadcast through Hasdrubal's scouts, Caesar through Vercingetorix's column counters, Ventidius through a spy he deliberately kept alive and fed. In every case, the false picture arrives stamped with the enemy's own trust, because it came from his own people, and a general who arrests a discovered spy, in this doctrine, is throwing away a working transmitter. The Allies rediscovered this rule wholesale in 1944, when the fictitious army group opposite Calais was sold to Berlin, largely through captured German agents transmitting under British control, and the Germans believed it for the same reason Pacorus believed Cineas. The lie wore the uniform of their own service. Rule 4. Deceive your own side too. Nero's night column, by Livy's account, was not told its destination until it was on the road, and Scipio's reverse deployment went out as orders in the pre-dawn dark, not as a plan debated in council. The Romans assumed, correctly, that an army that knows the secret leaks the secret through deserters, prisoners, and camp talk. So the circle of knowledge was kept to the commander and the moment, and the price was willingly paid. Soldiers marching to an unknown destination, subordinates executing halves of a plan whose whole they never saw. Rule 5. Break the pattern only once, and commit everything to the break. None of these operations had a second act or a fallback. Scipio attacked with his whole army at the single dawn the routine had purchased. Nero stripped his own front of its best 7,000 men on the strength of one intercepted letter, knowing that if Hannibal probed the thinned camp even once, Rome could lose both armies and the war in the same month. Ventidius bet the defense of Syria on one sentence spoken at dinner. A pattern break spends the entire investment the moment it happens, because the enemy who survives it will never trust your routine again. And Roman commanders behaved as though they understood that this was a weapon that fired exactly 1 round per campaign. Which brings us to the promised name, and to a Roman who has been standing behind this entire video. In the 1st century CE, Sextus Julius Frontinus, 3 times consul of Rome, governor of Britain in the 70s, where he subdued the Silures of South Wales, and later the man Nerva put in charge of the city's aqueducts, a job about which he wrote a separate surviving book, sat down and wrote a field manual called the Stratagemata, the Stratagems, a collection of several hundred real examples of military trickery sorted by category for serving officers to study. 3 books survive securely, arranged by phase of war: tricks before battle, tricks during battle, tricks in sieges, with a 4th book of disputed authorship attached, and the organization tells you what the Romans themselves thought mattered most. Because Book 1, Chapter 1, the first subject a Roman officer was expected to master, is titled, in the Latin, De Occultandis Consiliis, on concealing one's plans. Scipio's tricks are in it. Nero's march is in it. The Ventidius dinner table story survives, in that level of detail, largely because Frontinus recorded it. Frontinus tells us he also wrote a theoretical treatise on the art of war, now lost, and that the Stratagems was its casebook, the worked examples to the vanished textbook. The later military writer Vegetius, whose own manual trained European officers for 1,000 years, cites Frontinus by name as an authority, and Machiavelli mined the Stratagems shamelessly. This is, quite literally, the Roman textbook of deception, written by a Roman for Romans, and it still exists in full. It has sat in the Loeb Classical Library in English since 1925, and translations are freely available today. So why does almost nobody outside specialist circles read it? Because of its format. The Stratagemata is not a narrative, and it has no argument. It is hundreds of short entries, a few sentences each, and modern historians treat it as a quarry rather than a book, mining individual anecdotes for footnotes, while the doctrine those anecdotes were arranged to teach goes unmentioned. The manual survived, the lesson plan around it dissolved. One caution is owed here. Scholars note that Frontinus, writing generations after some of these events, occasionally garbles names and details, the spy at Ventidius's table being one example, so any single entry deserves cross-checking against Polybius or Livy. But the pattern he organized, the pattern this video has been tracing, is confirmed by the earlier sources at every major step. If you take one idea away from all of this, take the one Hasdrubal Gisco never got the chance to learn from. On the last morning of his army's existence, nothing he saw on the plain of Ilipa was hidden from him. The Roman deployment happened in the open, in daylight, in front of 70,000 witnesses. What beat him was not a secret. It was a week of true, boring, carefully repeated afternoons that taught him what to expect, deployed against him as precisely as the legions themselves. The Romans built roads, walls, and aqueducts that still stand, and it is easy to remember them as an empire of stone and drill. But the record they left, from the Metaurus to Mount Gindarus, argues that their most reliable weapon weighed nothing at all. It was the enemy's own certainty, patiently manufactured, and then collapsed on schedule. If this changed how you will read the next Roman battle you come across, a like genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want their history at this depth, and subscribing means you will not miss what we open next from the archive. I will see you on the next battlefield.